You are listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast with Maggie Green, episode number 385.
Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast, a podcast that celebrates cookbook readers, buyers, collectors, writers, and clubs. And now your host, cookbook author, culinary dietitian, and cookbook writing coach, Maggie Green.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. How is everybody doing today? Having a quiet week here in my cookbook bunker, enjoying the sunny, cold weather, occasional dustings of snow, spending some time going for walks, doing some quiet work here, talking to cookbook authors, teaching my students, and as many of you know, I'm starting to gather the paperwork I need to take to my accountant for my year-end business tax return. So that's always a very annual thing to do. I like to try to get it done this month, get that out of the way. So I'm going to take a little break from that to introduce our lovely interview today with Pyet Despain. Pyet is a member of the Prairie band Potawatomi Nation tribe. She's an award-winning and global private chef and the first winner of Gordon Ramsay's groundbreaking cooking competition series, Next Level Chef. Pyet's life work is dedicated to Indigenous fusion cuisine, where she combines the food of her heritage, both Native American and Mexican. Her passion is to uplift Indigenous culture and traditions via storytelling, traveling, and cooking. Originally from the Osage Indian Reservation in Kansas City, Kansas, Pyet now resides in Los Angeles, California. Today on the show, we talk all about her beautiful new book, Rooted in Fire. Pyet tells us more about the book, who it's for, her journey from idea to book, and then we walk through the book looking at its concept, the message she has for cooks and bakers, the table of contents, and deep dive into the chapters of the book, as well as some recipes in the book that we can all try at home to experience the food of her Indigenous people. So without further delay, let's dive into this interview with Pyet Despain. Hi, Pyet. Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so excited that you're here. I've always loved kicking off the new year with fresh faces, new people to talk to, all about brand new cookbooks. But before we dive into talking about your book, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, definitely. Bonjour. My name is Pyet, short for Pyet Wetmokwe. I am a chef, obviously a private chef, but also now an author. I'm originally from Kansas City, between Kansas City and Oklahoma, but now I reside in Los Angeles. And I really love to dive into Native American, Indigenous, and food sovereignty foodways and really uplift my community in that way. And of course, me being both Mexican and Native, I like to bring all of that in together and represent that through the food and the work that I do.
Great. So how long have you been in California?
I've been in California now for 9 years.
Wow. So yeah, you're going on that's almost like, that's a pretty long time. I mean, to be there and to be entrenched in what you do. So I understand you're also a private chef.
Yes.
Yes. And you cook privately then for people in their homes?
Absolutely. I first started my business, Pyet's Plate, as a meal prep service and a wellness and coaching service. And then I veered into just doing private chefing so I can really, just do what I want to be creative, not be restricted by any trending diets. And so I really dove into the private chef world. So now I do private events and private dinners. I don't have private clients that I'm working with regularly anymore, but if an opportunity came, of course I would take it. But I just love creating just like special moments for people, really.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And do you get to use some of your, the Indigenous foods and the things that you are talking about in your book when you do your private chef work?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of these recipes were some of those starting points that I was utilizing as an entryway for some of my clients, just to get them interested in that type of food because it's very new to a lot of people. And at the time when I was a private chef, I was trying to figure out ways to kind of slip in some ingredients and just kind of mix it up a little bit for them. And so some of these recipes were those recipes that I created for specifically for that reason.
That's wonderful. So tell us a little bit about your journey then from, doing your cooking, being a private chef, to the book, and how this whole idea for the book unfolded. And then we can talk a little bit more specifically about the book and what's in it. But everybody always loves to hear the journey.
Definitely. Well, the book came right after winning season 1 of Next Level Chef. I had a friend that was really, advising me to strike while the iron is hot, and they were like, you have an interesting story and you should write a cookbook. And the original idea was to write a children's cookbook because I'm very passionate about educating our youth. I spent a lot of my time now in my career spending time with the youth, educating them on our indigenous foodways so that way they can, just be knowledgeable about what they can be eating other than McDonald's and like just kind of feeling rooted in that. And so it was the idea initially was for a children's cookbook. And then I kind of veered into let's just write a cookbook for adults first so people can just get to know who I am as a chef outside of what they've seen on Next Level Chef. I can really begin explaining who I am and where all that passion that they saw on the TV screen, where that comes from. So that was the basis for this book, Rooted in Fire. The name of it initially was supposed to be Pyet's Plate, but it kind of started taking on a life of its own. As authors know, you start with this idea and then it kind of goes into these other different pathways and journeys, and it kind of creates a life of its own. And so Rooted in Fire was really, a name that came from the many twists and turns that happened as I was writing the book. So the cookbook is obviously filled with lots of beautiful pictures of food and also recipes, but it's a lot of storytelling. It kind of reads like a memoir. And that was something that initially was not what I intended, but with some advice from my publishing team and the editors that I was working with, they were like, Pyet, we need to know more about you because you have this like very unique story, and let's amplify that. And so it became more like a memoir.
Yeah. And that makes a book like this more than just a set of recipes. It really becomes a very personal book, I'm sure, for you to create these stories and to write about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of story in here, a lot of obviously personal stories, but also just some guidelines for those that want to learn more about indigenous foodways, because this is a topic and a type of food that is very new to the public within the last couple of years. You have people like Sean Sherman and Crystal Wapape and myself that are kind of like the faces of indigenous food and indigenous foodways, but there are so many other chefs and people that are in our communities doing this amazing work that are really amplifying the teachings. And so this book is the book that I could have utilized at my starting point of diving into indigenous foodways and reconnecting through the food. And so it is kind of just there's a lot of layers there.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting when you become an author and you're writing about it. You're right. There's often so many people that we're standing on the shoulders of, right? We're authors of a book, our face is out there connected to this topic. But I think that we always have to look around and look behind us and look who has led the way. So I would love it if you give us a little bit of a primer about indigenous foodways, what this means, what it means to you, what you would love for our audience to know.
Absolutely. So the bare bone basic kind of definition of what indigenous foods are, because that's kind of where we have to start, is the foods that were eaten before any type of influence from the settler countries that came into the Americas. And so this is before, beef and chicken and all the proteins that we know and eat today. We really want to focus on what was here before then, what were these people from different regions eating. And me specifically, my tribe originated from the Great Lakes area, from that little lower peninsula area of the Great Lakes, from Chicago all the way through Indiana. And we migrated during the Indian Removal Act on the Trail of Death. and we wound up in Kansas. And so when I think about reconnecting to indigenous foodways in that way, I think about, well, what were my ancestors eating before they migrated? And what are they eating now that they have migrated? But it's really about honoring the food systems that were here prior. And we weren't just hunters and foragers. They were very, very educated farmers. And so it's really honoring that knowledge, those teachings, the connection to the land, that reciprocated respect for not just the land, but also the animals and everything that is, in place to make our ecosystem survive and live. And it's just that connection of it. And even down to how many seeds you're planting in your garden. The number 3 is very sacred. So you're planting not just for yourself to be able to harvest later, but also for Mother Earth. And then the 3rd seed is for our four-legged kin, the animals that want to come by and nibble on that harvest as well. So you're keeping that in mind. And that one example really symbolizes just that reciprocation of energy and love and respect that we all should really be thinking about when we think about the food systems that we're a part of. So when I think about indigenous foodways, kind of explaining that to someone for the first time, that's really what I lead with.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think that probably is a misnomer, that people think it was all hunting and gathering, but that's not true. There was organized farming and growing of their own crops and things going on. And it's very important to be able to remember that, how knowledgeable, educated, and well-rounded they were in terms of the types of foods that were grown. So I do think it's wonderful that the books now can present this information to a larger group of people. My first exposure to it was actually through the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. that opened for, is it the Native American Museum? And the cafeteria has all the different regions and different types of foods that you can eat. And I think I don't know, it was just I thought the best cafeteria of all of the museums that were there. Loved seeing the way that even regional cuisine was present in those different areas, depending on if they were near the Great Lakes or near an ocean or more inland. And I'd love if you would talk a little bit about how this influenced what's in your book and the table of contents for your book, and the journey that your book took as it unfolded in terms of the recipe content.
Definitely. When I approached the books, like the way that the chapters would lay out, within indigenous foods or Native American dishes and things that I grew up eating, there really wasn't, if you think about it, like a breakfast, lunch, or a dinner. It was just kind of based on what was available and what they could harvest and what was in season during that time. So that's the way that I really wanted the book to flow. And so I was keeping all of my proteins together, all of my, so we have the way of the hunter. We also have the way of, or not the way, but the forage from the fields, or gather from the fields, or gather from the garden. Now I can't even remember harvest from the fields, gather from the garden.
Yeah. And then forage for your sweet tooth, it says. Yes, very good. Yeah.
And then, so I really wanted to make sure I was keeping things that were kind of like paired in that way based off of ingredients. And that's really the way that the layout of the book, was kind of set out. And then at the very end of the book, I have celebrating the seasons. So a lot of knowledge is in that last chapter, which honestly is my favorite chapter because I nerd out a lot on some of the little specifics and the details. But there's really some call to actions on how we navigate and move through seasons, not just because of the holidays, but because it's, it's colder outside or it's sunnier outside than, in the summer than it is in the winter, and how we're really taking time to, reflect on like what's going on around us in this modern day world. I know people can't go out and hunt and gather and forage or even garden themselves because of lack of space and land, and just the landscapes of where we live have changed over time. But at least we can really honor those seasons by, taking a walk and understanding like, oh, like during the springtime, this is what we're noticing. And the air has changed, the weather has changed, and really just taking inventory of all those things allow us as human beings to reconnect with, weather and place and Mother Nature in all these different ways. And so I'm so like a spiritual person, and that for me is my grounding, is just getting out in nature or even spending time with friends and having meaningful conversations. So that last chapter really is kind of me navigating through that and sharing that with the readers. But when it comes to the recipes, now the recipes are something that were a collection of memories of my childhood and things that I grew up eating, but also things that I found along the way of my journey of reconnecting to my indigenous foods. And I live in a modern day, and I didn't grow up eating indigenous foods every day. Of course, I had the regular American diet, just as everyone else did. We were eating, corn dogs and hamburgers and McDonald's and KFC, on the weekends, or pizza. Like, we were eating those things too. But as I became an adult, to have that question and or that conversation with myself, or what are indigenous foods? What did my ancestors eat? When I started that reconnecting, that's when I was able to really plug in some of that knowledge into my kitchen and teach my own family about it, and teach my mother about it, who is my connection to my native side.
Yeah.
And then also mixing that in with other things that I grew up eating from my dad's side of the family, which they, if you read in the book, I talk about how they were restaurant owners and they're very passionate about the foods that they were cooking. And there's very competitive on my Mexican side of the family, like, whose tamales are better, who has the best salsa. Like, we were always just listening. Like, I was always listening to my uncles and my dad like argue back and forth of like, this needs more salt, or you should have put this in there and put that. So it was really fun to like incorporate all of that into these little memories and these, subheadings to each of these recipes, just to give the reader kind of like that sense of like feeling of home, or there's a lot of little stories that maybe other people can relate to. And then of course I talk about, all of that being said, I did have some identity issues growing up, not figuring out where I fit in, but not just really feeling like I fit in one place or the other. And then that was one of my biggest insecurities, which now is my biggest superpower as, as a chef, but also just as a female in this culinary world. You have to really figure out like what's going to set me, apart from my competitors as a private chef in this big city of Los Angeles. And so little by little, I start kind of piecing together all of these pieces. And that is what makes up Rooted in Fire, the book. So, as I mentioned, there's lots of layers there, but it's just really kind of like honing in my adult ADD. Like, I want to talk about this, I want to talk about that, but doing it in a way that like flows and makes sense to everyone.
Yeah. The identity piece for every cookbook author is such a big deal, in particular for first books. And yours had a couple of different layers to it. It wasn't only stepping into being a cookbook author, but also stepping in, like you said, into this combination of your Mexican ancestry and your indigenous ancestry, and bringing those two things together to make yourself, well, it's not to make yours, it's to be really who you are.
Exactly.
And tell people about that evolution and how that has become your superpower, because it has. I think that that really is the secret to presenting ourselves online and to other people, is really truly being willing to be who we are.
When I decided to be on a national wide like cooking competition, like on TV, and put myself in front of the cameras in that way, I had been doing a lot of like self-work and self-reflection during that time, because in Los Angeles as a chef, I was having a really hard time just making ends meet. And so when I thought about my life in terms of like my business trajectory, I had to figure out what was making me stand out from the rest, because I was trying to sell up a service. But within that, I figured out like I have to compare myself to anyone else. I can just be myself and do what makes me happy and follow that pursuit. And I think that's when really things really started to change for me. And having those questions as an adult, I think around this age, I was maybe 27, 26 years old when I was like, oh, I think I finally know who I am. And that takes some time as just a normal human being, of trying to figure out who you are. And that was that really, crucial, pivotal time for me. And it just happened to be really wrapped in my identity, was wrapped into my career. And so going on to Next Level Chef and being able to represent myself and feel so confident in who I was and at that time and what I was representing, which was my heritage. And I just went in there and I cooked food that I knew that I would cook for my family.
Yeah.
And I had to cook like, if this is going to be my last time to cook for Gordon Ramsay, I wanted to feel like home, you know? And
Yeah.
that's just the way that I approached everything at that point. So after winning Next Level Chef, I had to face the fact that I am now going to be on different podcasts. I'm going to be asked to be doing different things here and there. And like, what do I want to do with this opportunity? And that was when I really started to just like really, really lean into, okay, like I went on national television and said that I wanted to represent Indigenous people in the food industry. And I think that's it. That's what I want to do because that's what I feel most passionate about. And it just aligns with everything else in my life. And so leaning into that was the greatest thing I could have ever done, but also because it feels and it is authentic. It is just
Right.
who I am. I don't have to like put on a show or like feel like I'm putting on my best face for anybody. I'm just being a real person with real conversations with and doing the real work in my community. I spend a lot of time with our youth and just figuring out what we need and not just we because there are so many different communities, but each community needs something different.
That's right.
And I've had the opportunity to go and speak to these people. And now I decided, I think my platform and my brand and everything else is revolved around just representation and being a light in the world in whatever way that means to me.
Yeah. And wouldn't it be amazing if we were able to affect the next generation of young children so that they knew that the true home, and especially when we're at that age when we're leaving the home from where we were raised or born, or like you, even leaving Kansas and going to California, I think it can be unmooring. You do kind of feel untethered, but really true home is when we come home to who we really are.
Absolutely. You said it best.
And then if children know that and they can reflect that to other people, it is just an amazing thing to be able to carry. And for you to show children the way with that and represent ancient cultures that have been in this continent for so long, it's just an incredible thing. And probably to me, when we stop and think about it, it probably feels like a huge responsibility, but I think that it's through food, it's so much more connected and easier to do because it's almost like the food tells the story for us if we just prepare it and talk about it.
100%. And you, with that connection, with the food and the knowledge and the understanding, the food in itself gives you the knowledge that you need to just spread,
Yeah.
and that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, it's amazing. Food is one of the best ways in cooking to connect to cultural conversations. I believe that wholeheartedly. I think that's one of the things that Anthony Bourdain did the best. In addition to his amazing writing skill and his way he was present on camera, he used it to connect with people who were not like him. But it's just it opens a door that anybody can walk through if they have an open mind. It's wonderful. So tell us about the fire part of this title. Originally, you said it was the title was changed, but fire was incorporated into the title. And I think there's an important reason for that. So I'd love for you to talk about fire.
Absolutely. In the book, within the first couple pages, I talk about being a member of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. We're known as the Fire Keepers. And of course, like fire came up so many different times, not just in the physical fire that I cook with, but the fire that I've had inside of me my whole life. I talk about kind of being, a little feisty, fiery adolescent young girl that just didn't know where to put all of my energy. And when I found cooking and when I found, that was my place, like the kitchen was my place, I was able to really put all of that energy into what I was doing with a career choice. And it just kind of all fell together in the way that it was meant to, but it took a little bit of time figuring it out. So I walked, many years just with this fire inside of me, not really knowing what to do within this energy, but there's just the fire represents so many different things in my life. And I remember specifically telling my mom when I came to the realization, reflecting that I had been homeless in Los Angeles. and I was couch surfing, and I had everything in the trunk of my car trying to figure out what to do in my life as a young woman in Los Angeles. My mom's like, "You need to come home."
Yeah.
And I remember specifically the sentence I said to her was, as long as I'm waking up every day with this burning desire in my heart to do something, like I can't just, throw in the towel and come home. I would forever regret that. And that sentence, and that idea was really what stemmed the rest of everything else, and just understanding that fire plays a huge part in who I am, and and my personality and my passion. So it represents all of that, and being a member of of my tribe, in which we utilize fire as in our ceremony. So rooted in fire really just was like the best title to encompass all in which what this book is.
Yeah. And sometimes I think as cookbook authors, we kind of get attached to the title that we think it might be, or the title that we worked our proposal around. But I think there always is value in trusting other people, especially if it's the publishing. Maybe they can see it from a different angle, from a different perspective. And I think that being open to a title change usually is a beneficial thing, unless an author really has a, major reason for sticking with something original. I think it's good to keep an open mind, and it is perfect because the fire feels a lot more deeper to me. It feels very connected to what you're talking about, and of course, cooking and fire go back how long? I mean, since the beginning of the dawn of man. They people making fire and then cooking something on it. That's what cooking's all about: the application of heat to some sort of food. So it's great. I love that it actually is connected to the tribe directly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't think that was a coincidence. Do you?
No.
Yeah, I don't really think so. So let's talk a little bit about the language of your people, and then we'll dive into some of the chapters.
Of course. So we have, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you. Yeah, I want you to, tell us all about it.
Yeah, so I really wanted to incorporate the Potawatomi language in this book because unfortunately our language is on the verge of extinction. There are only a handful of fluent speakers left in our communities, and being a fire keeper, to dive a little bit into that as well, is being a conduit of the knowledge that are and the traditions that our people have, and keeping all of that alive, and making sure that I'm doing my due diligence as an Indigenous person to stay connected to that and to continue to inspire others to stay connected to it in our communities. And so I don't speak fluently, but I am learning, and I started learning maybe over a decade ago. I printed out this entire encyclopedia of all of these like terms and dictionary, and just trying to learn. And I got to learning all of my numbers, but then I was like, well, I don't have anyone to talk about this with. My mom she doesn't know our language, and my grandmother didn't know our language. And now that you go online, you can find a lot of language courses, which is phenomenal and great, because we are in the middle of a movement of really inspiring our youth to want to be fluent speakers of our Potawatomi language. So I was like, I think it would be really awesome to add some of that language into the book. That way it's published and it's there and it's tangible. And obviously being a member of my tribe, that's something that's very important to us. And so I wanted to make sure that there was that connection with the language and with every single chapter, just giving some words and just what is the word I'm looking for? Translating some of those translating some of those words that pertain to each of these chapters, I thought was going to be a really awesome way. And I'm currently working on a YouTube series that's going to live on the education page of my website, where you can hear the language being spoken. And those are just super helpful just to hear and learn for our youth, for them to be able to use that as a learning tool. But I think a lot of people can read it and say, oh, I wonder how you pronounce that, or, just I want to get people more curious about our language. And so I'm really excited about that. That adds another layer into just the work that I do. It's taking a little bit more time than I anticipated and hoped, but I think that everything comes and waves in the way that it's supposed to. And I've been working with a lot of people that represent different Potawatomi tribes. So we actually have 8 bands of our tribe. So working with each of them to kind of not narrow down some of the dialect of our language. But the language is a derivative from the Anishinaabe language that also the, Ojibwe people, we also kind of speak the same language, but they're different dialects. So it's really about kind of like identifying what our dialect is as Potawatomi people within this group of people. So the language is something that it's very particular, it's very hard to speak, but it's beautiful. So the language was something that was very important to me.
Yeah, I think so too. So there's a nice, some pronunciation keys and also a code that helps with learning the language and some pronunciation in the book. So that's a great tool for people if they're using the book or perusing the book to be able to link to that information. So let's start with chapter 1 because it's called The Way of the Hunter. And let's talk a little bit about meat and the types of protein sources that you use in the book and why those were chosen and what people might expect from a cookbook and maybe a little bit about sourcing some of the foods if we're going to try to cook them.
Absolutely. The Way of the Hunter obviously talks about respecting the animals that we're consuming if we are consuming animal protein. And I tell a personal story and journey about how my grandfather is a hunter, and I went hunting with him for the first time a few winters ago and was able to experience that firsthand. Later on, or earlier that year, I was actually able to do a bison butchery class with a group of Indigenous women, and it was led by some Lakota leaders of their tribe. And just that experience alone was just out of this world, and just all the education that came along with it, and the connection to the bison with the Lakota people specifically was just something that stays with me and I think about very often. And just to learn about the beauty behind these animals and how they're seen as relatives, but not just relatives, ancestors, because they came before us. And a lot of our Indigenous tribes across the United States, the way that we learned a lot of our social cues and social roles are by watching animals. So just to give you one example, for us as Potawatomi people, we're connected to birds, and birds are very sacred for us specifically. And when we go and do our ceremonial dinners, rather than standing in a line when you're going through the buffet of food, that everyone brings something and they bring something to the table, and instead of going and standing in a line, we all flock to the table as if we were birds. We get what we want to get a little bit, and then we go back to our seats, and then when we want more, we'll come back. So it's not like we are standing in line. And that was just really to honor the social roles and just to mimic the behavior and the characteristics that we see and hear in animal life, because those are our ancestors and we learn a lot from them. The northern tribes learned that maple trees gave us sap by watching squirrels, tap sap out of maple trees. So it's little things like that we really thought about, as Indigenous people. Like, we have to honor these other animals and these other living things that are just as important as we are. So I really wanted to dedicate the animal protein chapter, the beginning pages, really honoring the bison and just really giving an explanation as to why we need to be thinking about these things when we're consuming protein meat. So of course there's bison meat. We also have whitefish that's wrapped in corn husk that's steamed. There's also a barbecue quail, raspberry mezcal barbecue quail recipe. There's also deer meat. We eat a lot of deer meat and a lot of bison in my tribe specifically because we're from the plains, and my grandfather does a lot of deer hunting every year for us, and every year he gets a buck from my mom for her birthday. So growing up eating deer meat was something that I didn't realize was a privilege and a gift, especially knowing that my grandfather brought it. For us, it was like, oh, we'll put it in the freezer and we'll use that when we don't have anything else to eat. And so it was kind of like that. So, but we were eating deer meat all the time. But just really honoring these proteins in a way that we don't normally see in the modern day. And I have seen now that there are more options for sustainable and regenerative protein options in some of our grocery stores. So bison is now very widely accessible to people in grocery stores. And now I'm starting to see venison being a little bit more accessible, which is great. So when we think about sourcing, where are we getting them from? But the greatest thing about bison specifically is that there are laws, conservation laws in place to protect the way that those bison are being ranched. And I think that's the best thing that we can do, is focus on regenerative, sustainable ways of consuming meat.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I live in northern Kentucky, and we're on the border of Ohio. And in southern Ohio, there's Vista Grand Ranch, which is a bison farm. So there is locally raised, and I don't know if they process it there, but you can buy their bison around the area at certain supermarkets. And so I always thought that was kind of fascinating that people were getting into that. And I know at my supermarket, it's not that brand in particular, but bison is readily available. And of course, fish would make sense. That's, easy for people to access. And then quail was the other one that you mentioned, which I think I've seen that also. So I do think that there is places people can get this. And of course, even in my own family, people that hunt, this type of the venison's available. So I think that it is, at least from now, sometimes I think my perspective is a little tainted because I'm kind of in the food space. Do you know what I mean?
right.
And I see things, I notice things, I pay attention to what's available for us to buy and know some food producers. But I do believe that from the protein perspective, more than just beef, lamb, pork, chicken, people are looking for some different types of things. So it's a very exciting time, and your recipes will fit in great with that and the history of them also, for sure. So the gardening is something that we kind of touched on earlier, that is kind of a misnomer, that it wasn't part of what indigenous people did. But let's talk about gardening.
Okay. Yeah, gardening is one of my favorite hobbies right now.
And I love the story about how they plant the three seeds. It makes me think of like even the Trinity. Like if you think about cooking, like New Orleans cooking, when they talk about the Holy Trinity and their vegetables that they saute to start gumbo, for example, that this concept of three things together, I think it shows up in a lot of different ways, not just in food, but even in people's faith traditions. So I love that was, that's a very important part of the gardening. And tell us a little bit about your experience with it, maybe even growing up, and what you'd like people to know related to your cookbook.
Absolutely. Well, I do speak a bit about the Three Sisters, which is in a sacred agricultural and planting method, which is the beans, the corn, and the squash, which are three very sacred ingredients for Indigenous folks across Turtle Island, or what we call United States. But also, as you mentioned, that number three being very sacred because of the seeds, planting one for Mother Earth, planting one for our relatives that are going to come nibble on it, our little animal relatives, and then, of course, one for us to harvest. And just having that intentionality and frequency goes a long way, especially when you are expecting the land to provide something for us. We have to be thinking in a way of reciprocation and just really honoring that relationship is that, I think, person that's very important. So I actually lost my grandmother last year, my native grandma, who I actually talk a lot about in this book, and it came as a surprise. She just her health just declined really rapidly within a 3-month span, and she had Parkinson's that she had been diagnosed with and had for quite some time, and it just kind of had its time to come forward, and unfortunately she didn't survive it. But she was not much of a gardener herself. She was the grandmother that would her specialty was chili dogs with extra onions. She didn't do much planting of her own, but she did often take me down the road when I lived on the reservation with her, to this guy who used to, he was kind of like our local gardener, and he just had a normal size of a home and lot, but the way that he utilized the the square footage of his yard was just like really, really interesting. And we would always go buy tomatoes from him or okra or whatever he was growing during that time of the year in the summer or whatever it was. We would be buying stuff from him. And my grandma used to always say, we need to support him. He's an old man and he survives off of what he sells in his yard. And so that kind of always stuck with me, even as an adult, and the older I got, the more I realized, like, you don't have to have a huge lot of land to go and plant stuff on your own. So I do a lot of gardening on my own now. And if there is when there is a second book, I really want to incorporate a lot of useful tips and tricks on how to garden in small spaces. But back to the topic of, gardening in the book, the actual chapter that is gather from the gardens is really honoring those ingredients that come fresh from a garden, kind of like your leafy greens, your salads and things like that, your vegetable forward dishes. And just I think more people in this generation and this time are wanting to garden on their own, specifically for the reason of not being able to trust our current food systems and the way that those are being grown, like the vegetables and the fruits being exposed to different pesticides and things like that. But, gardening just allows us to really connect further and deeper to land and understanding the importance of soil health. And that's something that I nerd out on frequently, is just talking about, soil health to other people and how I'm getting my soil healthy in my backyard so I can grow what I want to grow in my yard. But it was and I bring up my grandmother because gardening was a really big part of my healing from that whole loss, which, I would go in my garden and just spend hours back there crying and planting seeds and just putting a lot of my sadness into that. But it was just something that was very healing for me during that time frame. And I think that is something that I will always have, which is special. And whatever grew from that time, I just thought, like, wow, look at all of these beautiful flowers that are blooming. Or during that time frame, I planted kale and we had, our first harvest of kale and we were eating this salad from kale that I grew in the backyard. And I was like, my tears are in the soil of this kale.
Yeah, what a wonderful tribute to your grandmother. She sounds like a wonderful woman, and the thought that she would financially help to, buy the vegetables from the gentleman down the street and support him through buying the food that he was growing is amazing. Even though it wasn't something that she necessarily, she probably enjoyed eating it, but it wasn't something that, she grew, or she just wanted to connect with him and share. Yeah. So that's amazing. She, I'm sure she lives in your memory. She's in this book. And I think that her memory, it's hard. Grandparents, it's interesting, especially if you spent time with grandparents. It's such a different relationship from our parents. And I was fortunate also, to spend time with my maternal grandmother. And there's just something about it that there's never another person that can fill that space. Very, very special people. So gardening is a wonderful therapy, I'm sure. And you're right, you don't need a lot of space. So I can't wait for you to explore that in your next book. All right. Soups and stews. Let's talk a little bit about that. And then also, let's dive into the soups and stews.
Definitely. So soups and stews, in my mind and heart, soups are the most underrated food of all cuisines. Like soups, I will never turn down a bowl of soup. I don't care what time of year it is. It's always one of my go-to kind of comfort foods, just because there's nothing more comforting than something that's been brewing and stewing for hours. And you just are able to build so much, dynamic flavor and just, it's just my favorite. It's my favorite kind of like dish. But this particular chapter of the book, I also incorporate fry bread, for obvious reasons that you eat fry bread with our soups and stews, especially us as Native folks. That's what is always on the table. That and corn soup was always on the table at my grandmother's house. So that's one of my most nostalgic dishes, is either the chicken pozole verde that I have in the cookbook, or the corn and bison stew. So my grandmother always made it with beef just because that was what was available. When we lived on the reservation, we didn't have access to much bison because my grandmother didn't eat it. She thought it was too gamey for her.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because that's one of her ancestral foods. But, then again, we have to like go back to the conversation of reconnecting folks with their ancestral foods. But,
That's right.
she ate, we had it with beef all the time, but I wanted to make sure I put bison in this particular recipe because I'm really converting myself into consuming more of that bison than the beef. But we have the bison corn soup, which is a staple in our family. My grandmother was the one that taught me how to make that recipe, and the fry bread as well were the two things that my grandmother taught me how to make simultaneously at the same time. I remember being in her kitchen and just, hearing her describe what to look for when you are making the dough for this fry bread and you want it to be sticky and light. And if it's too hard or if you mix it too much, this is what's going to happen. So I just remember her specifically, giving me those details so that way I understood what to look for, because our grandmothers don't teach us with recipes. They teach us with, actually showing us and saying, oh, look how much is in my hand. This is about how much you want to put in there. And it's like, okay, let me try to like convert those little salt cups to teaspoons in my mind as a chef. But and then of course the chicken is not indigenous, but it's something I grew up eating. And we talk about being authentic. I was like, it wouldn't make sense for me to put rabbit in this pozole because I didn't eat rabbit that. So I kept it true to what I grew up eating, and pozole was always something that we loved to eat on the weekends, either pozole or menudo. I didn't love menudo because of the texture of the tripe, but chicken as a child, a younger was I could do that. But those were my two favorites growing up. And the soups and stews. There's also a New Mexico soup, which I made for the first dinner that I ever made as, stepping into being a chef that focused on indigenous foods. The New Mexico soup stew was the one of the dishes of a 4-course meal that I created for my friends on my birthday one year. They said, Pyet, where do you want to go for your birthday? I said, oh, I don't want to go anywhere. I'm going to host a dinner, a 4-course dinner, and you guys are going to buy tickets, and I'm going to feed you on my birthday. And they're like, you're crazy. But it was a success and it was great. And that New Mexico stew is something that I made for that, and everyone absolutely loved it. So it became a staple from that point forward. But this particular chapter for me is it just speaks home. It speaks of all my favorite things. I think a lot of people, when they, get offered a bowl of soup, they instantly have this like warm feeling in their spirits and in their hearts. And they're like, oh, I'm going to be full after this, but just the right amount of full. I'm not going to feel heavy. You're going to feel like nourished and hydrated. So soups are one of my favorite things to eat.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think they're the best. And sometimes just the flavors that even just the broth contain, and then the nice vegetables, and then the meat that you put into it, it's wonderful. That pozole looks really good. I love radishes on the pozole, and the green pozole with the radishes looks beautiful. So I'm going to have to give that a try.
Mm-hmm.
So hominy and dried corn. Can you talk about that for a minute? I see the dried corn used in the bison and corn that your grandmother taught you. And then, of course, hominy is something that is used often in pozole. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So hominy and korma are obviously in the same family, but
Right.
they are texturally a little different, and obviously they taste a little different. So the corn that is utilized in the bison and corn soup is specifically a sweet dried corn. And that sweetness of that corn really brings the broth to life in that corn and bison stew or soup. And that was something my grandmother said, you always have to use sweet corn. And she told me specifically look for copes, which oddly enough at this point is not even popular anymore. But during her time, and in Oklahoma, she could find it at her very specific spots that she would go shop at. And she was like, oh, I can find it. And then she told me to look for that. And the more I started looking for it, I'm like, grandmother, I can't find this corn anywhere. But funny enough, when we were doing the photo shoot for this particular recipe, we were looking, I was like, I want to go look around and see what I can find in this big prop studio. And they had this super old antique Copes canister that had just been randomly sitting on the shelf. And I was like, wow, this is a coincidence. You know what I mean? It's like,
what
this
are the
is
chances
great.
of that, right?
What are the chances? So I utilized that when we were doing the photography for that particular dish, which I thought was so cool. But dried sweet corn itself has just such a there's we see corn as a relative. There's over 2,000 species of corn. Unfortunately, we only get to see the gold yellow one in our grocery stores. Sometimes you'll get a chance to find a blue corn somewhere, but it's usually like in a flower. You don't really get to see the cobs, the blue corn cobs. And if it's Thanksgiving time or fall, you'll see what we call quote unquote Indian corn, which is more so the brown and reddish variations that are kind of like those fall colors. And I think Whole Foods now does a pretty good job at being able to provide that for whatever people want to use it for decorative reasons. But there's over 2,000 species of corn, and I could go on for hours about how beautiful corn is. And my most recent adventures in life was I'm now an executive producer and host of a show called Spirit Plate with PBS. And we take a trip over to the Onondaga Nation where we meet with Angela Ferguson, who's the director of their Indigenous food and farm program. But they have a seed bank, and it's the world's largest seed bank of indigenous seeds and corn kernels and seeds and beans and squash, and just going in there and looking at all of these beautiful variations of colors of corn. And of course, some of them are the whiter, bigger corns, like white corn that look like hominy. And so just like being able to incorporate corn in these recipes for me is super important. And I want to do more with corn, and I want to explore more of recipes with corn. But for this particular story that I talk about, going back to the seed bank, the moment I walked into this room of the seed bank and they had all of these seeds and these corn kernels in jars labeled and where they come from and how old they are, we're talking about corn that is like 4,000 years old. Corn that has been, brought in to her from other museums or different, crevices of the world, or of the country, of saying, I found these kernels in someone's basement and they were labeled, and she had these in her possession, and they guard them like their relatives. And the moment you walk into this room, you can just feel the spirit of the ancestors, and it put just goosebumps all over my body. And I just I felt like this, like if it just felt so overwhelming and powerful and just beautiful. And I knew from that point forward, I was like, I actually have a corn kernel, the cob tattooed on my wrist, but I got that before this happened. But I've just been I feel so connected to this particular crop, and it's one of the most powerful crops in the world now, because of what it's used for in so many different variations of ways. But as an indigenous person, the corn represented so many different things and resilience. And you hear about these stories about how, for the Apache folks, their cornfields were burnt down during the removal of indigenous people and their food systems. And the Apache people had to utilize that corn to feed themselves. So they had to eat burnt corn. And now if you look at some of their traditional recipes, they incorporated specifically burnt corn. And just the evolution of food and the things that have taken place in the history of indigenous people from this country, and corn, the connection to it, it's very beautiful. So when we think about the variations of corn, it's good to see.
Because, we think about the variations of dried beans, like so many different varieties of dried beans. And I think what you're describing to me sounds like corn. It's the same thing. It's just hasn't really probably been totally explored through cookery here in the U.S. And where did you say the seed bank was located?
It's in Onondaga Nation, which is near Syracuse, New York.
Amazing. Yeah, those kinds of places are really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's an amazing story. So that's very exciting about the corn. I don't know how it'll all unfold. Maybe you know a little bit more about that. But beans obviously have taken on kind of a life of their own. I wonder if corn will do the same.
I hope.
Yeah. Because the shapes, sizes, colors, black beans, all the different. I say you could make a mosaic out of different types of dried beans.
Yes, absolutely.
Probably could do the same thing with the corn. If you thought about all those different shapes and colors that were in the room that you were in, same thing. Have they tried to grow any of them? Do you know?
Yes, they well, what they do is they return them back to the tribes in which they belong to.
Yeah.
And the tribes have to be prepared because once it's basically like returning an ancestor's
Yep.
bones
Yep.
to the grave. That's kind
Yep.
of what it feels like. And so she has to educate them on
Are they
like
allowed to grow some then if they can? Yeah.
yeah, if the tribe gives them the okay and they feel called to, they'll do it. But they themselves have been able to um find some seeds that were particular to that region and replant them. So they actually have a squash, and I have this on the episode if you're ever interested in watching it. It's PBS Spirit Plate on a Dog Nation.
Okay.
And I got the privilege of eating a squash from a 4,000-year-old seed that they replanted, and they got four of them. And one of the four is the one that they cooked it and they preserved it, and then we ate it there on show. And we cooked it, and it was just so delicious, and it was
Yeah.
unlike any squash
Yeah.
I'd ever had in my
Yeah.
life. It was
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. I think as seeds are, everything's been so narrowed down to like what we have available in the supermarket. And I think the closest I came to something like that was when we went to drink wine from really old vines, like Zinfandel vines. Maybe they were in California. Now, California, of course, they had a blight, but there were certain wines that, they were able, or vines that were still able to survive. And
Mhm.
I think old, ancient agricultural things that are still continuing to produce, or that we have the seeds for that are still, that potential it was still there for that corn to like grow. It's
Yeah,
incredible. And the same thing for the squash that you just ate. I guess the potential never goes away inside the seed. It just has to be taken care of, planted,
absolutely.
grown, and then I guess the seeds can be saved again. So it actually multiplies the availability once you plant it and
Mhm.
save the seeds. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Mhm.
Heirloom tomatoes. So many different varieties and kinds. I think there was a story about a gentleman in the South that had done the same thing for tomato plants, collecting heirloom apples, and different varieties of apples. So it's really, really fascinating. And that's where you would, it seems so narrow, but yet it's so deep, for all these different foods, different varieties, different seeds. Um, it's great. So, yeah, thank you for talking about the corn. I think that's wonderful. All right. So, one other chapter I wanted to talk a little bit about was the tea and the tea and spirits, because there's some really interesting drinks in here that are still very connected to nature. Something that I noticed that you've said a couple of times is the noticing of things taking place in nature and how that informed the indigenous people about what they should try to do, like the squirrels and the maple, and
Mhm.
paying attention to the seasons and the daylight and what's going on outside that during that time of year. And
Mhm.
the tea that caught my attention is the one with cedar in it. I think
Yeah.
maybe because it's winter time and we just, have kind of this time of year. I love pine trees, evergreens like that. So tell us a little bit about that tea.
Absolutely. So the cedar and maple tea is something that is very sacred for me specifically, mainly because of the cedar. The cedar for our tribe is a medicine, plant medicine that we utilize during our smudging. So California white sage has been very popularized across, the
Yeah.
world really for utilizing as smudging because that's what the folks over in this region did because I live in Los Angeles. But cedar is actually something kishki is what we call in our Potawatomi language is a sacred plant, and that's utilized for smudging and different ceremonial purposes for our people. But it's also an amazing tea, and the first time I ever had cedar tea was during a naming ceremony for my nephews. I was obviously too little to remember my naming ceremony. Naming ceremonies is when you get your native given name from your tribe. That name is a namesake that has been in the family lineage for many years, and so we just passed down those names, and they stay within our family. So I remember being at my nephew's naming ceremony and having the cedar tea with maple, and it was just so incredibly just, I don't really know how to, it just tasted healing. When you think
Yeah.
about something tasting foresty and green, like that's exactly what it tastes like. It just tastes like you walked in to a field of pine trees or cedar trees, but it's in your mouth, and it's just so delicious, and it pairs perfectly with the maple. And so this is something that I like to drink when I'm doing a little, quiet time for myself, or if I'm doing some kind of like meditation or ceremony for me, and that alone time is really important. And so this is a tea that I like to make for that. This entire chapter actually kind of reveals a few layers of me, because I went through and I'm back on it, but I go through these journeys of sobriety. And I spent a year being sober, curious, and just wanted to see the benefits of it. And I first started doing I'll go a couple weeks with no alcohol, and I'll do a couple months with no alcohol. Well, a couple months turned into like about a year. And so I just recently, for the holidays, was able to enjoy a few cocktails and stuff. I love the flavor of alcohol. I just don't love the effects of it.
Yeah.
And especially mezcal, like that smokiness. There's a lot of
Yes.
mezcal in this, and the recipes of some of these cocktails, but there's some mocktails in there for those that don't enjoy spirits. But and the teas for the sake of, I love herbs. I love kind of brewing a nice cup of tea. I have tea every single day, whether it's in the morning or at night. And it's good for us. And I think
Yes.
there are so many benefits to tea that people don't realize. Like some of our issues, health wise or skin wise, can be healed with,
Tea.
herbal remedies with
Yeah.
tea.
Yeah. So can you touch on foraging for us? And if that's something that you've discussed in the book, or what you would want people to know if they
Definitely.
are going to maybe approach some of these things, what's important to remember?
Absolutely. When you're foraging, you always want to make sure you're foraging from a space and a place that is not close to a busy road, because all of the emissions from the gas and vehicles, they can taint whatever it is that you are going to be consuming. So I would say try to go out into nature. Obviously, be respectful. If whatever it is that you are foraging, do research on the proper ways to forage, because when it comes to people that I've seen out here in Los Angeles, when they're foraging sage, for instance, you have to know that you don't take the branches or the plant that's closest to the ground, because those are the younger plants. You want to get the leaves that are a little bit higher and bigger, and you only take a little bit. So here we go with our sacred number 3, but we always take 1/3 of what's there, because you want to leave the rest for either someone else, or you don't want to like over forage. So making sure that you have something to come back to is very, very important. And just doing lots of research on making sure you're identifying the right plants is very important, because there's obviously dangers out there of eating the wrong thing or touching something that you shouldn't touch. So I would definitely say education is major key. But foraging is something that I love doing, and I felt empowered doing on my journey of reconnecting and just being able to identify things and what they're used for. So now I'm in my backyard in my garden, and if I see some dandelion greens that most people would say, "Oh my gosh, these are weeds. If we're getting rid of them," I'm like, "We'll leave that one. We'll leave that patch there, because I make tea from dandelion greens
Yeah.
now, or
Yeah.
I'll eat them in my salads." And so just little things like that is just feeling really empowered by understanding the use of some things, and that you don't have to get rid of everything that you consider a weed. But yeah, foraging is something that have found very empowered with
Yeah. That's
that
great.
knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful. So, as we're wrapping up, thank you so much for everything that you've told us today. I think we've barely probably just scratched the surface. I think everybody needs to tune in to Spirit Plate on PBS and learn more about what you know from your ancestors, what you've learned. And I would love for you also to tell us a little bit about your journey with cookbooks, and if you have a favorite cookbook that has influenced your work in the kitchen, or a cookbook that you turn to outside of your own.
A cookbook that I really have enjoyed, always come back to it, not just because the photography is absolutely stunning and the food styling is stunning, but Colombiana by Mariana Velasquez. She initially was a food stylist that turned into a cookbook author. And after reading her story, people were telling her, you've worked in this industry for a long time. You know what you're doing. You should come up with your own cookbook. And she was like, well, what am I going to write about? And of course, she writes about her heritage from Colombia and the way that she has been able to beautifully articulate this country without, kind of like you were talking about Anthony Bourdain, taking us to these places and allowing us to feel the culture in a different way than being there was through TV. And she's doing it through this book. And the way that she has the portraits, the pictures, the styling, everything is just so incredible. And I took a lot of inspiration from that book for the photography for my book, just because everything was so just moody and like lived in and just looked organic and just stunningly beautiful with all the colors. And the book is incredible. The history is incredible. Her personal touch and storytelling is beautiful in this book, but she herself is a phenomenal food stylist. And I am a kind of an artsy kind of gal. So I care about things like that, but it's something that it's a book that I really love. And the recipes, I've tried a few of them and delicious.
Yeah. So I will link to that in the show notes. Looks like a beautiful book, came out in 2021. And I think it's fascinating when someone photographs their own cookbook.
Yeah.
I mean, because the work that goes into writing it and then the layer of photography on top of that. It's always amazing to me that people can do that and have that skill of doing beautiful food photography.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So as we're wrapping up again, I'd love to have you tell everyone how they can connect with you online.
I am not available, but you can find me on Instagram at Chef Pyet. I also have a TikTok that's also Chef Pyet, and I have Facebook, but it's under Pyet's Plate. I also have a website that's www.pyetsplate.com where you can find all of the many things that you are looking for when it comes to Pyet's Plate and Rooted in Fire. And of course, I have my education linked there, my educational videos for language on the website.
That's wonderful because that's a totally different, connected to the cooking, but a whole different avenue and a way for you to share your knowledge. So again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Pyet, it's been great to meet you. I wish you nothing but the best. And again, I'm talking about her beautiful new book, Rooted in Fire, a celebration of Native American and Mexican cooking. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. Again, all the links can be found in the show notes at www.cookbooklove.co. And if you are interested in writing a cookbook of your own, please check out the free cookbook writing masterclass called How to Get Paid to Write a Cookbook. It is designed specifically for food or nutrition experts, and you can check that out at www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/free. So that's it for today's episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. This is your host, Maggie Green. And until next time, have a great day and keep loving your cookbooks.
Thanks for listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast. You can find out more information at www.cookbooklove.co.